The way my aunt looked at me, it was like I was an uninvited stain on her perfectly manicured lawn, a smudge on the crisp white of her family reunion. It was the kind of look that made your skin crawl, a silent judgment delivered with a practiced, almost imperceptible tilt of her head, a slight tightening around her lips that spoke volumes without uttering a single syllable. We were gathered for the annual summer cookout, a tradition steeped in forced cheer and simmering resentments, a tapestry woven with threads of obligation and unspoken rivalries, and I, as usual, felt like an outsider peeking in through a frosted window, observing a life I was meant to be a part of but never quite was. This year, though, the disdain was more pointed, more personal, as if she'd sharpened her gaze specifically for me. "Oh, you're here," she'd said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness that could curdle milk, as I carried in the potato salad, a dish I'd spent the morning carefully preparing, hoping it might serve as some small offering of peace. It wasn't a question, not really. It was a pronouncement, a subtle declaration of my unwanted presence, an announcement that my arrival was noted, and not in a good way. The rest of the family, a blur of familiar faces that rarely held genuine warmth for me, a constellation of relatives whose interactions with me were often perfunctory at best, had turned. My uncle, a man whose general demeanor was one of amiable detachment, offered a tight, dismissive nod, his eyes flicking over me as if I were a minor inconvenience on his path. My cousins, already deep in their own established cliques, their laughter and conversation already a self-contained unit, barely registered my presence, their focus remaining firmly within their established social circles. I'd spent years enduring these subtle digs, these quiet exclusions, these constant, gnawing reminders that I wasn't quite the right fit, that I occupied a space in their collective consciousness that was perpetually on the periphery. I'd learned to build a shell, a protective barrier woven from resilience and a healthy dose of self-preservation, to absorb the barbs and retreat into myself, a solitary island in a sea of familial expectation. My Aunt Brenda was the undisputed queen of this family hierarchy, the architect of its unwritten rules and the enforcer of its unspoken social contracts. She controlled the narratives, the seating arrangements, the guest lists, and most importantly, who was deemed worthy of her approval, a currency more valuable than gold in our particular ecosystem. And I had never been worthy, not by her meticulously crafted standards. My life, by her discerning metrics, was a series of missteps and disappointments, a narrative of unmet potential. I hadn't married the right kind of person, the kind who would neatly slot into her envisioned familial tapestry. I hadn't climbed the corporate ladder to her satisfaction, the rungs she deemed essential for true success. I hadn't produced grandchildren with the proper lineage, the continuation of a bloodline she held in such high regard. Every family gathering felt less like a reunion and more like an audition, a performance where I was perpetually destined to fail, to fall short of her exacting expectations. This particular year, the pressure felt amplified, a palpable tension in the air that had been building for weeks. Brenda had been dropping hints, veiled allusions to a major announcement she was going to make at the cookout, a revelation that was clearly intended to eclipse all other events of the day, perhaps even the year. It was clear she expected everyone to be impressed, to bask in the glow of whatever triumph she was about to unveil, to offer their unreserved admiration. I, of course, had no idea what it was, but I knew my role, my designated position in this unfolding drama, the silent observer, the one who would inevitably be compared unfavorably to whomever she was parading as her latest success, the foil to her brilliance. I found a quiet corner of the yard, a strategic retreat away from the boisterous games and the forced laughter, a sanctuary where I could observe without being observed, where I could be present but not a participant. I watched Brenda hold court, her voice amplified by the collective attention of the family, her presence commanding the room with an effortless, almost regal authority. She was recounting some anecdote about her youngest son's recent promotion, a story that seemed to stretch on for an eternity, punctuated by her own delighted giggles and appreciative murmurs from the assembled crowd, a chorus of affirmation that seemed to sustain her. She finally reached the crescendo of her tale, her eyes scanning the faces of her audience, and then, with a deliberate, calculated movement, they landed on me. "And speaking of achievements," she announced, her voice carrying across the lawn, a spotlight inadvertently finding me in my quiet corner, I wanted to share some truly exciting news about our family's recent investments. "As many of you know," she continued, her tone shifting slightly, becoming more assured, more authoritative, "I've always been a shrewd businesswoman, and I've been working tirelessly behind the scenes to secure our financial future. Thanks to some very wise decisions, our family's portfolio has grown exponentially over the past year. In fact, we've just finalized a significant acquisition that will provide substantial dividends for generations to come. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle, basking in the odd silence that followed, a silence that was more of a hushed reverence. This wasn't just luck, mind you, she added, a subtle emphasis on the word luck, as if to preempt any suggestion of chance. This was years of planning, of foresight, of making the right choices. The room hummed with speculation, a low murmur of excited whispers. My uncle looked exceptionally pleased with himself, preening beside Brenda, a proud peacock displaying his plumage. Cousins whispered amongst themselves, no doubt wondering if they would benefit from this newfound prosperity, if this significant acquisition would translate into tangible advantages for them. I felt the familiar prickle of being on the outside, of not being privy to these wise decisions or right choices, of existing in a separate financial universe. I'd always assumed they managed their finances quite capably, even commendably, but Brenda's pronouncements always carried an undercurrent of superiority, a tacit acknowledgement that I, with my more modest savings and less flashy career, was somehow lacking, somehow incapable of grasping the intricacies of true financial success. Then, her gaze drifted back to me, a thinly veiled challenge in her eyes, a direct, unwavering stare. Some people, she said, her voice a little louder now, the sweetness replaced by a sharp, cutting edge, just don't have the knack for these things. They settle. They don't take the necessary risks. They don't have the vision. The implication hung heavy in the air, a direct hit, an arrow aimed squarely at my heart. She wasn't just talking about financial acumen, she was talking about my entire life, my perceived lack of ambition, my choices, my very essence. For years, I'd swallowed these judgments, these quiet pronouncements of my inadequacy. I'd nodded, smiled, and retreated, the sting of her words fading into a dull ache. But something about that moment, about the sheer arrogance of her delivery and the public nature of the shaming, felt different. It wasn't just Brenda's usual condescension, the subtle digs she was so adept at delivering. It was a deliberate attempt to belittle me in front of everyone, to reinforce her position as the matriarch, the arbiter of all things successful, and me as the perpetual disappointment, the family black sheep who could never quite measure up. The anger didn't erupt in a fiery outburst. It didn't manifest as a sudden, explosive retort. Instead, it solidified. It became a quiet, cold resolve, a steely determination that settled deep within me. I didn't have Brenda's flair for the dramatic, her penchant for public pronouncements and grand declarations. My strengths lay in observation, in quiet persistence, in understanding things that others overlooked, in the meticulous piecing together of details. The cookout continued, the atmosphere thick with Brenda's pronouncements and the family's sycophantic agreement, a performance that felt increasingly hollow. I excused myself early, the weight of their collective approval of Brenda's genius a suffocating blanket, an oppressive reminder of my own perceived shortcomings. The drive home was quiet, the silence punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the internal processing of the day's events. Back home, I didn't stew. I didn't engage in self-pity or wallow in resentment. I didn't plot a grand, retaliatory scheme that would explode onto the family scene in a dramatic fashion. Instead, I did something far more effective, something that suited my temperament and my strengths. I started digging. Brenda had been so smug about her acquisitions and investments, so self-assured in her pronouncements of financial prowess. She'd implied a level of sophistication and insight that, frankly, I doubted she possessed. Her husband, my uncle, was a decent enough man, kind in his own quiet way, but hardly a financial titan, his knowledge of the market seeming more anecdotal than analytical. Their vision usually involved following prevailing trends rather than anticipating them, a cautious participation rather than an audacious leap. I spent the next few days quietly researching the market trends Brenda might have been chasing, the sectors that had seen significant growth in the past year, the areas that would attract the attention of someone looking to make a splash. ICR. OSS referenced news reports about large, private company acquisitions, scanning financial publications and industry journals, piecing together a puzzle based on Brenda's vague yet boastful clues. It wasn't difficult to pinpoint a few likely candidates, companies that had made significant moves and were garnering buzz. Brenda, in her quest for ostentatious displays of wealth, for something tangible to brag about, wouldn't have been subtle. She would have invested in something visible, something that could be easily pointed to, something that shouted success. Then, I found it. A small, but rapidly expanding company that specialized in a niche but highly profitable area of sustainable technology. Their IPO had been the talk of the financial news for weeks, a promising prospect that had captured the attention of many, but they were still privately held, with substantial pre-IPO funding rounds that had fueled their growth. The news of their impending public offering was circulating, a ripple in the vast ocean of financial information, but it was still largely under the radar for the casual investor, requiring a more diligent search than Brenda's pronouncements might have suggested. I also remembered a casual conversation with an old acquaintance, someone I'd kept in touch with sporadically over the years, someone who worked in venture capital. A few months back, during a chance encounter, he'd mentioned a particularly promising startup he was involved with, a company that was making significant waves in the green energy sector. He'd been remarkably discreet about the details, bound by confidentiality agreements, but he'd hinted at a significant valuation and a planned public debut that would undoubtedly make headlines. At the time, it had been just another interesting anecdote, a glimpse into a world far removed from my own. Now, it clicked into place with an almost eerie precision. My resolve hardened, not with aggression, but with a quiet certainty. Brenda's pronouncements about planning and foresight were about to be put to the test, not by my confrontation, but by the simple unfolding of events. I didn't need to announce my intentions, to broadcast my own potential success. I just needed to let the truth emerge, to allow the facts to speak for themselves. The quiet unfolding of events would be far more devastating than any carefully crafted accusation. A few weeks later, the first official announcement came, not from Brenda, not from within the family, but from a major financial news outlet. The company I suspected Brenda had invested in was indeed going public, and the projected valuation was even higher than anticipated, a testament to its rapid growth and market potential. Suddenly, Brenda's vague pronouncements about significant acquisitions and substantial dividends weren't so vague anymore. They were concrete, quantifiable, and the subject of widespread financial discussion. The family group chat, which had been relatively quiet since the cookout, as if still reeling from Brenda's pronouncements, exploded. Everyone was congratulating Brenda and my uncle, marveling at their financial prowess, their vision. They were basking in the reflected glory of Brenda's perceived genius, their admiration renewed and amplified. I stayed silent, an observer of their renewed enthusiasm, a silent witness to their collective shift in perception. The true turning point, however, wasn't the initial announcement of the IPO. It was the second one, a week later. A much more specialized financial publication, one that focused on private equity and early-stage investments, a publication read by those in the know, those who understood the deeper mechanics of the financial world, published a detailed exposé on the very same company. It wasn't about the IPO itself, not directly. It was about the early investors, the individuals and firms who had taken a chance, who had seen the potential when it was still a nascent idea, who had provided the crucial seed capital. It listed the names of the individuals and firms who had put in significant capital before the recent market frenzy, the ones who had truly taken the necessary risks. And there, nestled amongst a list of well-established venture capital firms and prominent angel investors, was a familiar name. But it wasn't the name everyone expected. It wasn't Brenda's name. It wasn't even my uncle's name. It was mine. Sarah Jenkins. My investment wasn't a staggering sum, not in the realm of corporate finance. I hadn't invested tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands, like Brenda likely had, a significant portion of her family's accumulated wealth. My contribution was far more modest, a testament to my own careful savings and my willingness to take a calculated risk. But it was at the right time. I had been an early supporter of a friend's venture, a personal loan, made years ago, when the company was just a concept scribbled on a napkin, a dream held between two hopeful individuals. I'd believed in the idea, and in the person behind it, enough to offer a small amount of my savings without expecting much in return, a gesture of trust and encouragement. My friend, grateful for the early support, for the faith I had shown when many others had hesitated, had always insisted on keeping me informed of the company's progress. And when the company started gaining serious traction, when its potential became undeniable, he'd offered me a small equity stake as a thank you, as a way of sharing in the potential upside, a genuine act of partnership. It wasn't a sophisticated financial play, not a calculated maneuver in the cutthroat world of high finance. It was an act of faith and friendship, a testament to loyalty and belief in the unseen potential. The article highlighted the unwavering belief of a few early backers who had seen the potential when others had not, who had recognized the quiet power of innovation. It spoke of their quiet support, their early faith, paving the way for larger investments, for the company's eventual trajectory towards market dominance. My name was mentioned as one of those quiet supporters, a testament to my discernment, my early insight. The family group chat went eerily silent. Brenda, who had been broadcasting her financial genius nonstop since the cookout, her messages filled with proud pronouncements and thinly veiled boasts, suddenly went radio quiet. Then, tentatively, almost bewildered, the questions began to surface. "Is this about you, Sarah?" my sister messaged, her tone a mixture of surprise and curiosity. The article mentions a Sarah, my cousin typed, their usual flippancy replaced by a cautious inquiry. Brenda finally surfaced, not with an explanation, not with an admission, but with a carefully worded deflection, an attempt to salvage her narrative. "There are many Sarahs in the world, you know," she typed, her words a flimsy veil of plausible deniability. "This is obviously a different Sarah." Her attempt to dismiss it was as transparent as glass, a desperate effort to maintain her carefully constructed facade. The article had included my last name, Jenkins, the same last name as Brenda's late sister, my mother. The connection was undeniable, the implication clear. The next family gathering was not a cookout. It was a much smaller, more subdued affair, an informal lunch at my parents' old house, a more intimate setting that felt somehow more appropriate for the shifting dynamics. Brenda was there, of course, a reluctant participant, but the air had shifted. The subservient deference that had always surrounded her was gone, replaced by a cautious curiosity, a subtle reevaluation of her position. My uncle kept glancing at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the changed landscape. My cousins, who had barely acknowledged me before, who had always treated me as an afterthought, were now making overtures, asking about my investment strategy, their interest piqued by the revelation. Brenda, stripped of her pedestal, seemed diminished, her aura of invincibility tarnished. Her pronouncements were few and far between, and when she did speak, her voice lacked its usual conviction, its commanding authority. She tried once, a weak attempt to reclaim her narrative, to reassert her dominance. "Of course, I recognized the company's potential early on," she began, her voice hesitant, a stark contrast to its former booming confidence, but her voice trailed off as she saw the polite, almost pitying smiles directed her way, the subtle shift in their collective gaze. They were no longer looking at her with awe, but with a quiet skepticism, a dawning realization. The true financial reveal wasn't about my sudden, obscene wealth, not about accumulating vast riches overnight. It was about the quiet validation of my choices, the understated success that had grown from genuine belief and personal connection rather than ostentatious pronouncements and calculated pronouncements. It was the realization that sometimes, the most impactful investments are the ones made in people, in ideas, in quiet support, rather than in spreadsheets and market trends. The social consequence for Brenda was subtle but profound, the erosion of her carefully constructed image, the unraveling of the narrative she had so meticulously woven. The family, witnessing this quiet unraveling, saw her not as a financial guru, a paragon of shrewd business acumen, but as someone who had likely benefited from more conventional wisdom, and perhaps, a touch of luck, while I, the perpetual outsider, had demonstrated a more authentic form of foresight, a deeper understanding of value. The sting of her insult had, inadvertently, exposed the hollowness of her boasts, and the quiet strength of my own path, a path paved not with pronouncements, but with quiet persistence and genuine belief.